He opened the security app, expecting to catch her slipping up. 9 housekeepers before her had failed. Stolen from him, neglected his daughters, left them crying in their wheelchairs while they scrolled through their phones. So when he saw those 3 pink wheelchairs sitting empty in the playroom, his chest tightened with familiar dread. Then he saw them. His 3 paralyzed daughters, Ava, Ella, and Mia, standing upright, their tiny legs trembling but holding weight, taking small shuffling steps toward Rosa's outstretched arms. Alexander's phone nearly slipped from his grip. His back pressed against his office chair, and the man who'd built a tech empire worth billions watched the impossible unfold on a 6-inch screen. 18 months ago, Alexander Westbrook lost everything that gave his wealth meaning. His wife, Catherine, died in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, returning home from the girl's 2nd birthday party. The semi-truck driver never saw her. One moment she was sending Alexander a voice message saying she'd picked up his favorite wine. The next, state troopers were at his door with expressions that shattered his world. Catherine had been his college sweetheart, the only woman who'd loved him before the money, before the success, before Forbes started printing his name. She'd kept him grounded through every acquisition, every late night, every moment when the pressure of running Westbrook Technologies threatened to consume him. 3 months after her funeral, the girls started showing symptoms. "Mr. Westbrook, I need you to sit down," Dr. Morrison had said in that sterile pediatric neurology office. "The tests confirm our concerns. Ava, Ella, and Mia have been diagnosed with a rare progressive neurological condition. It's affecting their motor control, specifically their legs." Alexander had sat frozen, unable to process the words. "Will they walk again?" Dr. Morrison's silence answered before his words did. "The damage is significant. At this stage, we're looking at permanent paralysis from the waist down. I'm very sorry." 2-year-old girls who'd been running through his Connecticut estate just months ago were now confined to custom pediatric wheelchairs. Ava with her curious brown eyes, Ella with her infectious giggle, Mia with her stubborn little chin, Catherine's chin. Alexander hired the best specialists money could buy. Neurologists from Johns Hopkins, physical therapists from Switzerland, experimental treatment facilities in Germany. Nothing changed. The girls sat in their wheelchairs, their little legs motionless, their futures redefined by a diagnosis that felt like a second death. Then came the housekeepers. 9 in 14 months. The first lasted 3 days before admitting she couldn't handle the sadness. The second he fired after finding her taking selfies with the girls in their wheelchairs, posting them to social media with inspiration porn captions. The third stole pain medication meant for the girls' muscle spasms and sold it. The fourth accessed his financial accounts. The fifth left them crying for hours while she made personal phone calls. After that, something hardened in Alexander. He installed cameras in every room, 32 high-definition feeds covering every corner of his home. He watched the footage obsessively, looking for the lie, the angle, the moment when whoever he trusted would betray him again. Control was the only thing that kept him from drowning. So when Rosa Martinez walked through his door, 28 years old, quiet, carrying worn credentials from a community college, Alexander didn't see a person. He saw the 10th failure waiting to happen. "No improvising," he'd told her, not looking up from her background check results. "Follow the care plan exactly. The neurologists have been clear about their limitations. Don't give them false hope." Rosa had nodded slowly, her dark eyes studying him with something he couldn't name. "I understand what you're saying, Mr. Westbrook." But she didn't follow his rules. Alexander watched through his cameras as Rosa sang Spanish lullabies to his daughters when she thought no one was listening. Watched as she moved their legs in gentle patterns the physical therapists had abandoned as pointless. Watched as she whispered encouragement like she believed they could hear her, like she believed their diagnosis wasn't the final word. At first, he watched to document her violations, to build his case for termination. Then he watched because he couldn't look away. Because something was happening in that playroom. Ava started smiling during Rosa's songs. Ella's toes began wiggling when Rosa played music. Mia held her head higher, tracking Rose's movements with focused attention she hadn't shown in months. Alexander told himself it meant nothing. He told himself hope was dangerous, that doctors knew best, that believing again would destroy him when it inevitably failed. But late at night, alone in his office with the blue glow of monitors illuminating his face, Alexander watched a housekeeper fight for his daughters with nothing but faith and consistency. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he thought had died with Catherine, something began to crack. He didn't trust it. He couldn't. Because hope, when you've buried it alongside your wife, doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a trap. But before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever felt like hope was too risky, like believing again might break you, this story is for you. Sometimes miracles don't ask for permission. They just show up. The mansion woke up the same way every morning. Quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest. Alexander stood in his home office, espresso growing cold in his hand, watching the early morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors. Through the window, he could see the groundskeeper already trimming the rose garden that Catherine had designed. The garden she'd never seen in full bloom. The fountain at its center hadn't run since the accident. Alexander kept meaning to have it repaired. He never did. Behind him, down the hallway that led to the east wing, he heard the soft whir of a motorized wheelchair. The night nurse was moving one of the girls, probably Ella. Ella liked to be positioned near the playroom windows when the morning light streamed through just right. Alexander didn't turn around. He used to. In the beginning, right after they came home from the hospital, Alexander would rush to every sound, every cry, every small movement. He would sit between their cribs for hours, watching their tiny chests rise and fall, terrified that if he looked away, something would go wrong. But that was before the diagnosis became permanent, before hope turned into something dangerous. Now he watched from his office. Alexander set down the espresso and turned to face the wall of monitors that dominated the room. 32 high-definition feeds, each displaying a different angle of his home. Living room, hallway playroom, main angle playroom, corner view kitchen, front entrance, back entrance, east wing corridor, west wing corridor. Every room, every corner, every blind spot eliminated. The mansion had 34 rooms total. Catherine had fallen in love with the place the moment she saw it. Old architecture, she'd said, running her hands along the stone walls. It has history. It has stories to tell. She'd wanted to fill it with life, with laughter, with the sound of children running through the halls. Alexander used 4 rooms now. His office, his bedroom, the kitchen when he remembered to eat, and sometimes the living room when insomnia drove him from his desk. Everything else felt like a museum, preserved but lifeless. Catherine's touches remained everywhere, mocking him with their permanence. The playroom she designed with pastel walls and hand-painted murals of butterflies and flowers. The 3 cribs she'd arranged in a semicircle so the girls could see each other when they woke. Those cribs sat empty now in a room Alexander never entered. The girls slept in medical beds in the playroom, adjustable frames, safety rails, monitors that tracked their breathing through the night. The hallways told their own story. Faint rectangular outlines marked the wallpaper where family photos used to hang. Catherine had insisted on them. Houses need faces, she'd said. Otherwise they're just buildings. Alexander had removed them all 6 months after the funeral. He couldn't pass her smile 20 times a day, couldn't see the hope in her eyes, the way she looked at him like he could fix anything. He'd failed her. Failed their daughters. Failed every promise he'd made in that hospital room when he held her hand and told her he'd take care of them. Alexander's phone buzzed. 6:58 a.m. Rosa would arrive in 2 minutes. He pulled up camera 7, playroom main angle, and waited. At exactly 7 o'clock, Rosa Martinez appeared on screen. She moved quietly through the door, setting her worn canvas bag on the chair near the window. 28 years old, plain features, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her credentials from the community college were legitimate but unremarkable. No red flags in her background check. No criminal record. No social media presence beyond a barely used Facebook account with 3 photos. Nothing that explained why she'd last longer than the others. The night nurse, Mrs. Chun, looked up from her clipboard. Rosa approached, and they exchanged quiet words Alexander couldn't hear through the speakers. Rosa nodded, reviewing the sleep charts, the feeding schedules, the medication logs. Professional. Methodical. Exactly what the protocol required. Mrs. Chun gathered her things and left. Rosa stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 pink wheelchairs. For a long moment, she didn't move. Just stood there, looking at Ava, then Ella, then Mia. Her expression was unreadable. Not pity, not sadness, something else Alexander couldn't identify. Then she knelt beside Ava's wheelchair. Alexander leaned closer to the monitor. Rosa didn't touch Ava immediately. She positioned herself in the little girl's line of sight and simply waited. Ava's eyes, usually distant and unfocused, shifted slightly. Rosa smiled, small, genuine, patient. "Good morning, sweet girl," Rosa said softly. Her voice came through the speakers with surprising clarity. "It's a beautiful day. Can you feel the sunshine?" She reached out slowly and adjusted the blanket across Ava's lap. The movement was careful, gentle, like she understood that everything about this room was fragile. Alexander's chest tightened. Rosa moved to Ella next, then Mia, repeating the same quiet greeting, the same careful attention. She wasn't rushing through a checklist. She was present. Like the girls were people, not tasks to complete. By the end of week 1, Alexander had found nothing. No violations. No shortcuts. No phone calls she shouldn't make or cabinets she shouldn't open. Rosa arrived at 7 o'clock every morning, left at 7 o'clock every evening, and spent those 12 hours following the care plan with quiet consistency. This worried him most. Everyone broke eventually. Everyone revealed their angle, their weakness, their reason for being there beyond the paycheck. But Rosa just showed up, day after day, patient and present and maddeningly professional. Alexander found himself watching her more than he watched for violations. The way she adjusted Mia's position in her wheelchair, checking the angle of her legs twice to ensure she was comfortable. The way she sang softly while preparing their meals. Spanish songs Alexander didn't recognize, her voice low and melodic. The way she read to them during afternoon rest time, even though they showed no response, as if she believed they could hear every word. It was midnight when Alexander pulled up the footage from earlier that week. He told himself he was reviewing for inconsistencies, looking for patterns that might reveal her true intentions. But that wasn't why he rewound to Tuesday evening, 6:47 p.m., just before Rosa's shift ended. On screen, Rosa sat on the floor between the 3 wheelchairs. The girls were already prepared for the night nurse's arrival, fed, cleaned, positioned for evening transfer. Rosa's work was done. She could have left early. Instead, she sang. A lullaby, soft and gentle, in Spanish. Her eyes moved between the 3 girls, checking each face, connecting with each one. Ava's eyes were closing. Ella's fingers had relaxed against her armrest. Mia's head tilted slightly toward the sound. Rosa's hand reached up and rested on Mia's small foot, not adjusting, not correcting, just touching, just being there. Alexander watched the timestamp tick forward. 6:51, 6:52, 6:53. Rosa stayed until 6:58, singing to 3 little girls who couldn't respond, who might not even understand, who the world had written off as permanent fixtures in their chairs. But Rosa sang like they mattered, like their lives meant something beyond medical charts and prognosis reports, like they were worth her time even when no one was paying her to stay. Alexander's throat tightened. Something stirred in his chest, something he couldn't name, something that felt dangerously close to the hope he'd sworn to bury. He closed the laptop and sat in darkness. Tomorrow, he'd watch closer. Tomorrow, he'd find the crack in her facade. Tomorrow. Week 2, day 4. Alexander had the morning routine memorized by now. Rosa arrived at 7 o'clock, greeted the night nurse, reviewed the charts. 10 minutes of quiet observation with the girls. Then breakfast prep at 7:30. But today, Rosa pulled something from her canvas bag. Something small, rectangular. A portable speaker. Alexander's finger hovered over the intercom button. She set it on the shelf near the window and pressed play. Soft Spanish guitar music filled the playroom. Gentle, melodic, nothing harsh or overwhelming. Just acoustic strings flowing through the air like water. This wasn't in the protocol. The girls had specific sound therapy sessions on Thursdays, administered by a licensed therapist. Random music wasn't part of the plan. Alexander's finger pressed closer to the button, ready to stop this before it went further. Then Ava turned her head. Alexander leaned toward the monitor, his breath catching. It was small, just a few degrees to the right, but unmistakable. His daughter, who spent most days staring at the same spot on the wall, turned toward the sound. Her curious brown eyes, usually vacant and distant, tracked toward the speaker. Rosa noticed too. She didn't make a fuss, didn't clap or call attention to the movement. She just smiled softly and adjusted the volume slightly higher, giving Ava more of what had captured her attention. Ella's toes wiggled against the footrest of her wheelchair. Alexander's heart pounded. He zoomed the camera in closer. Ella's small foot moved again, just slightly, flexing in time with the rhythm of the guitar. Mia's eyes opened wider. Her head tilted, and she tracked the sound as Rosa moved across the room. For the first time in months, Mia was following something, engaging with something beyond the empty space she usually occupied. Alexander's finger pulled back from the intercom button. He told himself to stop this, to end it before Rosa got ideas, before she pushed too far. But his hand wouldn't press the button. Instead, he watched his 3 daughters respond to music in ways they hadn't responded to anything since the diagnosis. The following afternoon, Rosa did something else that wasn't in the protocol. She brought books. Not medical manuals or therapy guidebooks. Children's books with colorful covers and worn spines that looked like they'd been read 100 times before. Alexander switched to camera 12, the corner angle that gave him a wider view of the room. Rosa arranged the girls' wheelchairs in a semicircle, then sat on the floor in the center, cross-legged, the book open in her lap. "Let me tell you a story," Rosa said, her voice warm and animated. "About a little girl who wanted to touch the stars." She held up the book, showing them the illustrations. A small girl standing on a hill, looking up at a night sky full of stars. Everyone told her, "The stars are too far. You'll never reach them." Rosa's voice dropped low, mimicking the discouraging adults. But the little girl didn't listen. Alexander watched, transfixed, as Rosa turned the page. She built a ladder anyway, one step at a time, one piece of wood after another. And every night, she climbed a little higher. Mia's eyes, usually so distant, so unreachable, were fixed on Rosa's face. Not on the book, not on the colorful pictures, but on Rosa herself. Like she was listening. Like the words meant something. Rosa changed her voice for different characters, made sound effects for the wind and the creaking ladder, paused dramatically before turning each page. She wasn't just reading. She was performing, giving everything to an audience that couldn't respond. But they were responding. In small ways Alexander had stopped looking for. Ava's breathing had changed, becoming more alert. Ella's fingers twitched against her armrest. And Mia watched with an intensity Alexander hadn't seen in his daughter since before Catherine died. "Did she reach the stars?" Rosa asked them, her voice soft. "What do you think?" Silence. But it wasn't empty silence anymore. It was expectant, like the girls were waiting, hoping, believing in the story just as much as Rosa believed in telling it. That evening, Alexander poured himself a scotch and pulled up the afternoon footage. 4:47 p.m. Rosa's shift would end in just over 2 hours. He fast-forwarded through the daily routines, lunch, medication, afternoon rest period, looking for anything out of place. Then he saw it and nearly spilled his drink. Rosa was on the floor with Ella. She had positioned herself beside the wheelchair, and Ella's small legs were in her hands. Rosa moved them slowly, rhythmically left, right, like she was teaching the muscles to walk, like she believed they could remember something the brain had forgotten. Alexander's jaw clenched. This wasn't in any therapy plan. No specialist had prescribed this. The physical therapist had explicitly stated that passive range of motion exercises had shown no improvement and were optional at best. Rosa was improvising, breaking every rule he'd set, making decisions about his daughter's care without consultation, without permission, without medical oversight. Alexander grabbed his phone. His thumb hovered over Rosa's contact information. Fire her. End this now before she gave his daughters false hope, before she pushed them toward disappointment that would break whatever fragile peace they'd found in acceptance. Then Ella laughed. It was small, barely more than breath, just a soft sound that bubbled up from her chest. But it was real. It was joy. It was his daughter expressing something beyond mere existence. Alexander's hand froze over the phone. When was the last time he'd heard his daughters laugh? He tried to remember. Before the diagnosis, surely. Back when they ran through the halls, when they chased each other in the garden, when Catherine would scoop them up and spin them around until they shrieked with delight. But that felt like another lifetime. Another family. People who no longer existed. He couldn't remember the last time. That realization hit him like a fist to the chest. Alexander set the phone down. His hands were shaking. On screen, Rosa was smiling at Ella, her face radiating pure warmth. I know, sweet girl. Feels good, doesn't it? Your legs are so strong. She moved to Ava next, repeating the same gentle pattern. Left, right, left, right. Ava's face remained neutral, but her body seemed to relax into the movement, like some deep part of her recognized the rhythm. Then Rosa moved to Mia. The smallest of the three, with Catherine's stubborn chin and Catherine's fierce spirit buried somewhere beneath the stillness. Rosa positioned Mia's legs carefully and began the same rhythmic movement. That's it, Mia. Your body remembers. We just have to remind it. Alexander watched, unable to look away. He should stop this. Should call Rosa right now and tell her to follow the protocol exactly as written. Should remind her that he was paying her to maintain his daughter's care, not to experiment with untested methods. But his fingers wouldn't dial. His voice wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep inside, in a place he'd locked away and sworn never to open again, a small voice whispered, "What if she's right?" Alexander closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of his office, the blue glow of monitors painting shadows across his face. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd put a stop to this. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. 3 weeks. 21 days of watching Rosa break every rule he'd established. 21 nights of footage that kept Alexander awake until dawn, replaying moments he couldn't explain, couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore. 3 weeks of watching his daughters respond to a woman who refused to accept the limitations doctors had carved in stone. Tuesday afternoon, Alexander couldn't take it anymore. He stood from his desk, legs unsteady beneath him. The office suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. 3 monitors glowed on the wall. Camera 7 showed Rosa on the floor with Mia, hands moving in those same rhythmic patterns. Left, right, left, right. Alexander walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed against the marble hallway, each step heavier than the last. The distance between his office and the playroom had never felt longer. Past the empty frames on the walls. Past the closed doors of rooms he no longer entered. Past the life he'd buried alongside Catherine. He didn't knock. Just pushed the door open and stood there. Rosa was exactly where the camera had shown her. On the floor beside Mia's wheelchair, his youngest daughter's small legs positioned in her hands, moving them in walking patterns no therapist had prescribed. Rosa looked up when the door opened. No surprise in her eyes. No fear. Just calm acknowledgement, like she'd been expecting this moment all along. "Mr. Westbrook, what are you doing?" His voice came out harder than he intended, sharp with 3 weeks of suppressed confrontation. Rosa didn't stop the movement. Didn't flinch. Motor pattern training. It helps build neural pathways. That's not in the protocol. No, sir. It's not. The admission hung in the air between them. Alexander stepped into the room, his hands clenched at his sides. Behind Rosa, Ava and Ella sat in their wheelchairs, watching with those curious eyes that had started seeing more than they should. I gave you specific instructions, Alexander said, his voice low and controlled. Follow the medical plan. No improvising. No experimental treatments. Rosa gently lowered Mia's legs and stood up. She wiped her hands on her pants and turned to face him directly. For someone who should have been intimidated, standing before a billionaire in his mansion, caught violating direct orders, she showed no fear. Only quiet resolve. The medical plan has them sitting in wheelchairs all day with minimal stimulation, Rosa said, her voice even. That's not treatment, Mr. Westbrook. That's maintenance. Alexander's jaw tightened. The doctors gave you a prognosis based on statistics. Rosa's voice stayed level, but something fierce lived beneath the surface. They looked at scans and charts and told you what usually happens. They didn't tell you what's possible. They're specialists, Alexander shot back. They've seen hundreds of cases like this. Have they seen your daughters? The question stopped him cold. Rosa held his gaze, unflinching. Have they sat with Ava and watched how she tracks sound? Have they noticed that Ella's muscle tone has improved in her left leg? Have they seen the way Mia focuses when she's engaged with something that interests her? Rosa's voice remained calm, but her words cut through every defense Alexander had built. Or did they just look at test results and give you statistics? Alexander felt heat rise in his chest, anger or something dangerously close to shame. You think you know better than doctors who've studied this for decades. I think I know that giving up on a child is the one thing guaranteed to fail. Silence crashed between them. Alexander's hands were shaking. He clenched them tighter, trying to control the tremor. Was it anger? Fear? He couldn't tell anymore. You're filling their heads with false hope, he said quietly, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth. When this doesn't work, and it won't, they'll be devastated. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes. Not pity, something deeper. Something that saw straight through him to the broken man underneath the billionaire facade. They're 3 years old, Mr. Westbrook. Her voice softened, but didn't waver. They don't know what false hope is. They only know what they feel. And right now, they feel someone believing in them. She paused, and the silence felt heavier than any words. Maybe for the first time. The words landed like a slap. Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind screamed accusations, arrogance, recklessness, unprofessionalism. But his voice wouldn't come. Because somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the fear, a small voice whispered that she was right. Rosa turned back to Mia and knelt beside the wheelchair. You hired me to care for them, she said softly, not looking at Alexander. That's what I'm doing. She resumed the leg movements, gentle, patient, consistent. Like he wasn't standing there. Like his authority meant nothing compared to what these 3 little girls needed. Alexander stood frozen, watching her ignore him. His mind screamed to fire her. Right now. Call the agency and have her replaced by morning. End this before it went further. Before hope became something he couldn't control. But his feet wouldn't move. Because deep down, in a place he'd locked away and tried to forget, a voice whispered something he didn't want to hear. What if she's right? What if you've been wrong about everything? Alexander turned and walked out. He didn't say another word. Didn't fire her. Didn't validate her. Just left, his footsteps echoing back down that long marble hallway toward his office. That night, Alexander sat at his desk with a termination letter open on his laptop. The cursor blinked at the end of the first sentence, patient and unforgiving. Dear Ms. Martinez, effective immediately, your services are no longer required. He'd written these words 9 times before. Different names, same outcome. His fingers knew the rhythm. Type the letter. Call the agency. Sign the paperwork. Move on. But tonight, his hands wouldn't cooperate. The cursor blinked. And blinked. Alexander stared at the screen until the words blurred together, until the house settled into silence around him, until dawn crept through the windows and found him still sitting there, still watching that cursor blink, still unable to type the words that would end this. Alexander stared at the screen until his eyes ached. The cursor blinked at the end of the first sentence, patient and unforgiving. Dear Ms. Martinez, effective immediately, your services are no longer required. He'd written these words 9 times before. Different names, same outcome. His fingers knew the rhythm by heart. Type the letter. Call the agency. Sign the paperwork. Move on. Protect what remained. But tonight, his hands wouldn't cooperate. They hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, unable to type the next line, unable to finish what logic demanded he finish. Alexander released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He minimized the document and pulled up the security footage instead. The house was quiet. Lights dimmed throughout the halls. Everyone should have been asleep hours ago. The girls transferred to their medical beds. The night nurse settled in the adjacent room. Rosa long gone back to whatever small apartment she returned to each evening. But the playroom camera showed a soft glow coming from inside. Alexander leaned closer to the monitor, his heart rate picking up. Camera 7, main angle. There, movement in the corner. Rosa was still there. It was past 11. Her shift had ended at 7. 4 hours ago. What was she still doing here? Alexander switched to camera 12 for a wider view. The girls should have been in their beds by now, but there they were, all 3 still in their wheelchairs, arranged in a semicircle. And Rosa sat on the floor in the center, cross-legged, a small lamp on the shelf casting warm shadows across her face. She wasn't doing exercises, wasn't following any protocol. She was just present, humming. Alexander turned up the volume. Her voice came through the speakers, soft and melodic. A tune he didn't recognize, something old and gentle, like a song passed down through generations. Rosa reached up and touched Ava's hand where it rested on the armrest. She didn't grab it, didn't adjust it. Just laid her fingers over Ava's small hand and left them there. You did so good today, Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so proud of you. Do you know that? I'm proud of you. Ava's fingers curled slightly. Just a small movement, but intentional. Responsive. Alexander's throat tightened. Rosa held Ava's hand for a long moment, then moved to Ella. She adjusted the blanket tucked around Ella's legs, even though it didn't need adjusting. Her hands moved with such gentleness, such care, like Ella was made of something precious and irreplaceable. Sweet girl, Rosa murmured, smoothing a strand of hair back from Ella's forehead. You're so much stronger than anyone knows. I see it. Even if they don't, I see it. Ella's eyes were closed, but Alexander noticed her breathing had changed. Slower, deeper, calmer. The way a child breathes when they feel safe. When they feel loved. When was the last time his daughters had breathed like that around him? Then Rosa turned to Mia, the smallest of the 3. The one with Catherine's stubborn chin and Catherine's fierce spirit buried somewhere beneath the stillness. Rosa lifted Mia's tiny hand with both of hers and pressed it against her own cheek. Her eyes closed. I see you, Rosa whispered, and her voice cracked. All of you. Every piece. You're not broken, baby. You're just waiting. A tear slipped down Rosa's cheek. And I'll wait with you. As long as it takes. Alexander stared at the screen, unable to breathe, unable to move. This woman, this stranger he'd hired 3 weeks ago, this person he'd watched obsessively for violations and betrayals, was sitting in his house at 11 o'clock at night, crying over his daughters, talking to them like they understood, like they mattered, like their lives meant something beyond medical charts and therapy schedules and statistical prognosis. When was the last time he'd done that? When was the last time he'd just sat with them? Not as a worried father calculating costs. Not as a man reviewing therapy reports or researching specialists or watching through cameras to ensure they were being cared for properly. When had he last been present, really present, as their father? He couldn't remember. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. The air left his lungs. His hands gripped the edge of the desk as the truth crashed over him in waves. For 18 months, He'd been watching his daughters through screens, monitoring them from a distance, paying people to care for them because he was too broken, too afraid, too buried in his own grief to do it himself. He'd told himself it was protection, control, the only way to keep them safe after everything they'd lost. But it was cowardice. Alexander closed the laptop slowly. The termination letter sat minimized in its window, waiting. He should send it. Logic demanded it. Rosa was dangerous. She was filling his daughters with hope that would shatter them when reality inevitably reasserted itself. She was defying medical professionals who knew better. She was breaking every rule he'd established to keep his family safe. But another voice spoke, quieter, deeper. What if she sees something you stopped looking for? Alexander stood and walked to the window. The garden stretched dark below, moonlight catching the edges of untrimmed hedges. The fountain that hadn't run since Catherine died sat silent in the center. What would Catherine say if she could see him now? See what he'd become? A man who watched his daughters through screens instead of holding them. A man so afraid of losing more that he'd stopped being present for what remained. A man who'd hired 9 strangers to love his children because he didn't know how to anymore. She would hate this. She would hate him. Alexander pressed his forehead against the cold glass, his breath fogging the window. He pulled out his phone, opened the termination letter one last time. His thumb hovered over the delete button. Dear Ms. Martinez, effective immediately, your services are no longer required. He pressed delete. The document vanished. Gone. Alexander closed his eyes and felt something release in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 18 months. He wasn't keeping Rosa because firing her was inconvenient. Wasn't keeping her because finding a replacement meant paperwork and background checks and interviews he didn't have energy for. He was keeping her because she was the only person in 18 months who hadn't given up on his daughters. The only person who looked at Ava, Ella, and Mia and saw possibility instead of limitations, who saw children instead of diagnoses. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the grief and the walls he'd built, Alexander needed to see what happened when someone refused to accept impossible, even if it destroyed him. He climbed the stairs toward his empty bedroom, his footsteps heavy on the marble. As he reached the landing, he heard it, soft humming drifting up from the playroom below. Rosa was still singing to his daughters. And for the first time in 18 months, Alexander Westbrook didn't feel completely alone. Week 4. Alexander stopped pretending he wasn't obsessed. Every night after the house went dark, he sat in his office and pulled up hours of footage, fast-forwarding through empty hallways, pausing on moments that made his chest tight, rewinding scenes he needed to see again and again. He told himself he was looking for inconsistencies, for proof that Rosa's methods were reckless or dangerous, for evidence that would justify ending this before hope became something he couldn't contain. But that wasn't why he watched anymore. The playroom had changed. Small things at first, things Alexander noticed only because he'd memorized every angle, every detail of that room through his cameras. Rosa had moved the wheelchairs closer together, arranging them so the girls could see each other instead of facing different walls. She'd replaced the sterile white blankets the medical supply company provided with colorful ones she'd brought from home, soft fabrics with patterns of flowers and butterflies that matched the murals Catherine had painted. And she'd added plants. 2 real ones by the window, their leaves reaching toward the sunlight. The girls need to see things grow, Rosa had said to the night nurse one evening, her voice carrying through the speakers. They need to know that growth is possible. Alexander should have stopped her. The playroom had a specific setup approved by the medical team. Every change needed authorization. But he didn't call, didn't send an email, just watched as the room transformed from clinical and cold to warm and lived in. Watched as his daughters seemed to breathe easier in a space that finally felt like it was meant for children, not patients. Thursday afternoon, the licensed physical therapist arrived for her bi-weekly session. Dr. Chin had been coming for 14 months, her visits as routine as the calendar that scheduled them. Alexander watched through camera 7 as she entered, clipboard in hand, professional smile in place. She started with Ava, examining muscle tone, joint flexibility, reflexes. Standard assessments Alexander had seen dozens of times. Then Dr. Chen's hands paused on Ava's leg. She tested the muscle again, pressing gently, moving the joint through its range of motion. Her head tilted slightly. She did it a third time. Alexander leaned toward the monitor. Dr. Chen looked up sharply and called Rosa over. They spoke quietly, heads bent together, too low for the camera's microphone to capture clearly. Alexander caught only fragments. Significant improvement. Unusual for this stage. What specific exercises have you been doing? Rosa explained something, her hands gesturing as she demonstrated movements. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, watching intently, then moved to Ella. The same careful examination. The same pauses. The same look of surprise that she tried to hide behind professional composure. Then Mia. Dr. Chen spent twice as long with Mia, testing responses, checking muscle tone, making extensive notes on her clipboard. When she finished, she stood and looked at all three girls for a long moment, then back at Rosa. Before leaving, Dr. Chen paused at the door. She turned back, her expression unreadable, but her voice clear enough for the camera to capture. "Keep doing whatever you're doing," she said. "I'll adjust the official protocol to include your methods." Alexander sat back in his chair. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Dr. Chun, a licensed physical therapist with 15 years of experience, someone who'd examined hundreds of children with neurological conditions, had just validated Rosa's methods, had seen improvement significant enough to alter her professional recommendations. This was real. The changes weren't wishful thinking or desperate hope. They were measurable, observable, real. That night, Alexander didn't just watch current footage. He went back, day by day, week by week, pulling up files he'd archived and watching them with new eyes. Rosa with Ella, moving her legs in walking patterns, over and over, the same rhythm, the same patient consistency, never frustrated when Ella didn't respond, never giving up. Rosa with Ava, helping her bear weight on her feet for just seconds at a time, Ava's small legs trembling, then holding, then trembling again. But each day, holding just a little longer. Rosa with Mia, arm exercises set to music, Mia's tiny limbs moving slowly at first, then smoother, more controlled, like her body was remembering something it had forgotten. Alexander pulled up footage from week 1, Rosa's first day. The girls sat motionless in their wheelchairs, eyes vacant, bodies still. Distant. Then yesterday's footage. Ava reaching for a toy on her tray, her arm extending with purpose. Ella's foot tapping softly to music Rosa played. Mia holding her head steady, eyes tracking Rosa's movements across the room with focused attention. The difference was undeniable. Alexander's hands trembled on the keyboard. He opened a new browser window, typed with shaking fingers. Neuroplasticity in children with progressive neurological conditions. Articles flooded the screen. Medical journals. Case studies. Research papers from universities he recognized, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, Mayo Clinic. He clicked the first one. Early intervention in pediatric neurological conditions has shown remarkable results in neural pathway development, particularly in children under 5 years of age. Another click. Repetitive motor pattern training can stimulate the brain to form new connections, essentially bypassing damaged neural pathways and creating alternative routes for motor control. Another. The infant and toddler brain demonstrates extraordinary plasticity. With consistent, targeted intervention, children with significant neurological impairment have achieved mobility outcomes far exceeding initial prognosis. Alexander read until his eyes burned, until the words blurred together, until 3 o'clock in the morning crept past and the house sat silent around him. Everything Rosa had said, neural pathways, the brain's ability to rewire itself, the critical importance of early intervention, it was all there. Published in peer-reviewed medical journals, documented in clinical trials, proven by research teams across the world. And he'd never looked. Not once in 18 months. He'd taken those first doctors at their word, accepted their verdict like a death sentence, stopped researching, stopped questioning, stopped hoping. Alexander closed the laptop and sat in darkness. His daughters were improving, actually improving, doing things those initial specialists said they'd never do. And he'd almost fired the woman responsible. Twice. The shame was crushing. Physical. A weight pressing down on his chest until he couldn't breathe. For 18 months, he'd poured millions into maintaining his daughter's limitations. Expensive wheelchairs, medical equipment, nurses who kept them comfortable in their diagnosis. But he'd never once fought for something more. Rosa had been here 4 weeks, making $15 an hour, and she'd accomplished what his fortune couldn't touch. Because she believed, and he'd stopped believing the day Catherine died. Alexander didn't sleep that night, or the next. He wandered his mansion like a ghost, passing through rooms he'd stopped entering after Catherine died. Each one a monument to a life that almost happened. Each one a reminder of promises he'd failed to keep. The formal dining room stood frozen in time. Catherine had wanted to host holiday dinners here. Thanksgiving with extended family, Christmas mornings with the girls opening presents by the fireplace, birthday parties with cake and laughter echoing off the high ceilings. The long mahogany table sat empty now, chairs pushed in perfectly, dust gathering on surfaces no one touched. The sun room faced the garden. Catherine had imagined reading here while the girls played on the floor around her, sunlight streaming through the windows, the sound of their voices filling the space with life. Alexander stood in the doorway, seeing her ghost in every corner. The reading chair sat empty. The shelves held books no one opened. The light came through just as she'd predicted, illuminating nothing but absence. The music room held a piano Catherine had insisted they buy. "I'll teach them," she'd said, running her fingers over the keys. "All 3 of them. We'll have concerts right here." The piano sat silent now, its lid closed, another dream sealed away. Alexander's footsteps led him to a door at the end of the east wing. A door he hadn't opened in over a year. The nursery. His hand trembled on the doorknob. He pushed it open slowly, and dust swirled in the shaft of moonlight from the window. 3 cribs stood in a semicircle, Catherine's design. She'd wanted the girls to see each other when they woke, to know they weren't alone. A mobile of moons and stars hung motionless above the center crib, its delicate shapes casting shadows in the dim light. A rocking chair sat in the corner, a folded blanket still draped over its arm. The blanket Catherine had crocheted during her pregnancy, working on it through every bout of morning sickness, every doctor's appointment, every anxious moment. The walls held the mural she'd painted herself. A night sky filled with shooting stars, each one trailing silver light across the deep blue. Alexander remembered her standing on a ladder at 7 months pregnant, brush in hand, refusing his offers to hire someone. "This is for them," she'd said, one hand on her belly. "I want them to know their mother painted wishes into their walls." She'd whispered to her pregnant belly that night, "Make a wish, my darlings. Make 1,000 wishes. I'll be here to help everyone come true." Alexander stood in the doorway, unable to step inside. His feet wouldn't cross the threshold. This room was supposed to hold their life, late-night feedings and lullabies, first words and first steps, everything a family was meant to be. Instead, it held dust and silence, and the ghost of a woman who'd never gotten to see her dreams come true. Alexander closed the door and walked away. He found himself in the main hallway where family photos used to hang. Faint rectangular outlines marked the wallpaper like scars, ghosts of a life that almost happened. He remembered each one. Catherine 8 months pregnant, glowing, her hands resting on her belly as she looked at the camera with so much hope it had hurt to see. Catherine in the hospital, exhausted but radiant, holding 3 tiny bundles against her chest. Catherine's last birthday before the accident, the girls barely 2 years old, their faces covered in cake, Catherine laughing as Mia smeared frosting in her hair. He'd removed them all 6 months after the funeral. Couldn't pass her smile 20 times a day. Couldn't see the hope in her eyes, the way she'd looked at him like he could fix anything, like he was strong enough to handle whatever life threw at them. He'd failed her, failed their daughters, failed every promise he'd made. Friday morning arrived without Alexander noticing. He'd been walking all night, room to room, ghost to ghost. When dawn light crept through the windows, he skipped his office entirely. Instead, he sat in the hallway outside the playroom, his back against the wall, and just listened. Rosa's voice filtered through the door, warm and encouraging. "That's it, Ava. Just like that. Your legs remember, sweet girl. They know what to do." A pause. The soft sound of movement. "Ella, baby, look at you holding that toy so tight. You're so strong. Stronger every day." Another pause. Music played softly in the background, something gentle and melodic. "Mia, you watching your sisters? You're learning, aren't you?" Taking it all in. Alexander closed his eyes. His throat ached. What had he done? 18 months hiding behind screens and spreadsheets. 18 months paying people to love his daughters because he was too broken to do it himself. 18 months accepting their limitations as permanent because accepting defeat was easier than fighting for hope. All while his girls had been waiting for someone to see them, to believe in them. Rosa saw them. A stranger, a woman he'd almost fired twice, saw what their own father had been too blind, too afraid, too buried in grief to notice. Laughter bubbled through the door. Small and breathy, but real. One of the girls, maybe all three. Alexander's heart cracked. That sound, that simple, pure expression of joy, was something he should have been creating. He should have been the one making them laugh, moving their legs, holding their hands, telling them they could do impossible things. But he hadn't been. He stood slowly and walked back to his office. This time, he didn't turn on the monitors. Instead, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out the photo he kept hidden there. Catherine, 8 months pregnant, glowing with life and hope. Her hands rested on her belly, and she looked at the camera, looked at him through time, with so much love and trust and belief that it hurt to breathe. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered to the woman in the photo. "I'm sorry for giving up, for hiding, for letting fear win." He placed the photo gently back in the drawer and closed it. Then he opened his laptop. Not to watch footage this time. Not to document violations or build cases for termination. He searched pediatric neurologists specializing in neuroplasticity, early intervention specialists, therapists who believe in possibility. He made a list. Names, phone numbers, emails, clinic addresses. If Rosa could accomplish this much in 4 weeks with nothing but faith and consistency and $15 an hour, what could happen with real support? Real resources? Real belief? Alexander stared at the list, and for the first time in 18 months, he felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, he wasn't ready for that word yet, but something close, something like possibility. He closed the laptop and stood. It was almost afternoon, almost time for the girls' rest period. He wasn't ready to walk into that playroom yet, wasn't ready to face what he'd become or what he'd failed to be. But maybe tomorrow he'd try. He didn't know that tomorrow would change everything, that in less than 24 hours, he'd open his phone and witness something that would bring him to his knees, that his entire world was about to shatter and rebuild itself in a single, impossible moment. But for now, Alexander Westbrook sat in his quiet office, holding the smallest seed of belief. And somewhere down the hall, Rosa Martinez was teaching his daughters to walk. Thursday, 2:47 p.m. Alexander sat in his office, laptop open, quarterly reports for Westbrook Technologies spread across the screen. Revenue projections, market analysis, board meeting notes, numbers that should have demanded his attention. But they blurred together, meaningless. His mind kept drifting to the playroom, to camera 7, to 3 little girls and the woman who refused to accept impossible. It was almost 3 o'clock. Rosa would be finishing the afternoon exercises right about now. He'd watched the routine so many times he had it memorized. Music first, usually something classical or Spanish guitar. Then motor pattern training with each girl. Then reaching exercises, encouraging them to extend beyond their comfort zones. Alexander rubbed his eyes and tried to focus on the spreadsheet. The board meeting was in 2 days. He needed to review these numbers, prepare his presentation, maintain the empire he'd built. But the numbers meant nothing anymore. His phone buzzed against the desk. Motion alert. Playroom. Alexander frowned. The timing was unusual. Rose's routine was precise, predictable. Motion alerts at 2:49 p.m. didn't fit the pattern. He picked up his phone and opened the security app, expecting to see Rosa moving the girls for an afternoon snack or a change of scenery. Maybe she was adjusting the plants by the window or rearranging the colorful blankets she'd brought. The image took a moment to register. 3 pink wheelchairs sat against the wall. Empty. Alexander's stomach dropped. His first thought was panic. Something happened, an emergency. The nurse had to rush them somewhere. Medical crisis. Seizure. Something catastrophic that explained why those wheelchairs sat abandoned in the center of the room. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. His hand was already reaching for his keys, his body moving toward the door, about to run down that hallway and… Then he saw them. Alexander froze. Center of the playroom. Hardwood floor gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Ava. Ella. Mia. Standing. His 3 paralyzed daughters. The girls doctors said would never bear weight on their legs, would never stand without support, would spend their lives in wheelchairs, were upright. Wobbly. Trembling. Their small legs shaking with effort. But standing on their own 2 feet. Rosa knelt 5 feet away from them, arms stretched wide open, tears streaming down her face. "Come on, babies," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Come to me. You can do it. 1 step. Just 1 step." Alexander's breath stopped. Ava moved first. Her small foot lifted from the ground, hovered in the air for a heartbeat, then landed again an inch forward. A step. An actual step. Alexander's hand flew to his mouth. A sound tried to escape, something between a gasp and a prayer, but his throat had closed completely. Ella went next. More cautious than her sister, more tentative. Her legs trembled violently, her whole body shaking with the monumental effort of defying everything medicine had told them was impossible. But she moved. 1 foot lifted. Came down. The other foot followed. 2 steps. A sound escaped Alexander's throat, something raw and broken, between a gasp and a sob, between disbelief and desperate hope. Mia stood between her sisters, the smallest of the 3. The one with Catherine's stubborn chin set in determination, Catherine's fierce spirit finally breaking through the stillness that had held her captive. She stood there shaking, her tiny arms stretched out for balance, her face scrunched in concentration. Rosa reached toward her, hands still open, still waiting, tears flowing freely now. "You can do it, sweet girl. I'm right here. I've got you." Mia's foot lifted. It came down. Another lift. Another impossibility made real. Another step. 3 steps. Alexander watched his youngest daughter walk toward Rosa's outstretched arms, and the world tilted sideways. His phone slipped from his fingers. It clattered against the desk, but he didn't hear it. His knees buckled. There was no strength left in his legs, no structure left to hold him upright. Alexander slid down from his chair, his back scraping against the desk until he sat on the floor of his office. His legs splayed in front of him, useless. His whole body trembling. On the phone screen, face down but still playing, he could hear Rosa's voice through the speaker. "Yes. Oh my God, yes. Look at you. Look at what you're doing." The sound of small bodies collapsing into her arms. Rosa gathering all 3 girls against her chest, pulling them close, sobbing openly. "I knew it," she cried, her voice thick with tears and triumph. "I knew you could. I knew it." Alexander sat on his office floor, unable to move, unable to think, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. Tears poured down his face. His whole body shook with sobs he couldn't control, couldn't contain, couldn't stop. 18 months. 18 months of doctors saying never. of specialists looking at scans and charts and delivering verdicts like death sentences, of neurologists from the best hospitals in the world confirming the same impossible diagnosis. Permanent paralysis, no hope of recovery, accept it and move on. 18 months of accepting that his daughters would spend their lives in wheelchairs, that they'd never run through the halls of this mansion, never chase each other through the garden, never dance or jump or climb or do any of the 1,000 things children were meant to do. And there they were, standing, walking, reaching toward a woman who'd refused to believe what the entire medical establishment had told her was true. Alexander pressed both hands against his face and wept. Not quiet tears, not controlled grief, not the careful, measured emotion he'd allowed himself in the 18 months since Catherine died. This was something deeper, something primal, something breaking open inside him that had been locked away since the moment those state troopers appeared at his door with expressions that shattered his world. Every failure flooded out, every betrayal, every night spent watching his daughters through screens instead of holding them in his arms. Every moment he'd chosen fear over faith, control over connection, safety over the terrifying vulnerability of hope. The shame, the regret, the hope he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. It all came flooding out in waves that shook his entire body. His daughters could walk. His daughters could walk. And he'd almost given up on them. Almost fired the only person who believed they could be more than their diagnosis. Almost chosen the safety of accepted limitations over the risk of impossible hope. Alexander sat on the floor of his office. The billionaire who'd built a tech empire, the man who controlled everything through cameras and protocols and carefully maintained distance, completely broken. And somehow, in the breaking, something inside him began to heal. Through the phone speaker, still playing face down on his desk, he could hear Rosa singing softly to his daughters. A Spanish lullaby. The same one she'd sung that first week when she thought no one was watching. Alexander closed his eyes and listened. Everything had changed. Everything. And he could never go back to the man he was. Alexander didn't know how long he sat on that floor. Minutes. An hour. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the sound of Rosa's voice through the phone speaker, the weight of what he'd witnessed, and the feeling of something fundamental shifting inside his chest. Finally, he found the strength to stand. His legs felt hollow, unsteady, like he'd forgotten how to use them. He grabbed the edge of the desk and pulled himself up, muscles trembling with effort. He didn't pick up the phone, didn't need to watch anymore. For the first time in 18 months, Alexander walked away from his monitors, down the long hallway, past the empty frames on the walls, past the silence he'd built around himself like armor. His footsteps echoed on the marble, but they sounded different now. Purposeful, moving toward something instead of away. The playroom door stood open. Alexander stopped in the doorway, and the scene before him imprinted itself on his heart. Rosa sat on the floor, all 3 girls in her lap. They were exhausted from their impossible effort, their small bodies limp against her chest. But they were there, alive, present, real. Rosa held them like they were made of something precious and irreplaceable. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling, a smile of pure joy and vindication and love. She looked up when she sensed him there. Their eyes met. Alexander had expected to see triumph in her face. Pride. And "I told you so" written in her expression. After everything, the confrontations, the doubts, the near firings, she'd earned the right to that moment. But that's not what he saw. He saw compassion. For him. Rosa didn't say anything. Just watched him with those steady, patient eyes, holding his daughters like she'd always held them. Like they mattered more than proving a point. Like their victory was enough. Alexander's legs gave out again. He dropped to his knees in the doorway, unable to take another step. His hands gripped the doorframe for support as his voice cracked with a question that had been building for 4 weeks. How? The word came out broken. How did you know? Rosa looked down at the girls in her arms, then back at him. Her voice was soft, gentle, holding no judgment. I didn't know, Mr. Westbrook. A pause. I just believed. Something inside Alexander shattered. The last wall. The final barrier between who he'd been and who he needed to become. He crawled forward on his knees across the playroom floor until he reached them. His hands shook as he reached out and touched Ava's face. Then Ella's. Then Mia's. His daughters. For 18 months, he'd watched them through screens. Loved them from a safe distance. Kept his heart locked away in a vault of grief and fear because losing more would kill him. But they were here. Alive. Fighting. Growing. And he'd almost missed it all. Alexander gathered all 3 girls into his arms, pulling them from Rosa's lap into his own. He pressed his face against their small heads, breathed in their scent, shampoo and baby lotion and something uniquely theirs. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Ava's hair. "I'm so sorry." He said it over and over, the words pouring out like a prayer. An apology for every day spent hiding behind monitors and protocols. Every night he'd chosen fear over faith. Every moment he'd let grief steal from them what little time they had together. The girls didn't understand the words, but they felt his arms around them, really around them, present and solid and here. They felt their father, finally, truly present for the first time since their mother died. Rosa quietly moved back, giving them space. But Alexander reached out with one hand and grabbed hers, holding tight. "Stay," he said, his voice raw. "Please." She nodded. They sat together on the playroom floor, a broken father holding his daughters, and the faithful woman who'd refused to give up when everyone else had. 3 pink wheelchairs sat pushed against the wall, no longer needed. At least not right now. Not in this moment. Alexander looked at Rosa through blurred vision, tears still streaming down his face. "You gave them their legs," he said. Rosa shook her head slowly, her smile sad and knowing. "No, Mr. Westbrook. They gave themselves their legs. I just reminded them they could try." Alexander closed his eyes, holding his daughters closer. Catherine would have loved this woman, would have recognized in Rosa the same fierce belief, the same refusal to accept defeat, the same capacity to see possibility where others saw only limitation. Catherine would have loved this moment. And somewhere, in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, in the warmth of his daughters' small bodies against his chest, in the impossible miracle he'd just witnessed, Alexander believed she was watching. The light shifted as the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the playroom floor. But the shadows didn't feel oppressive anymore. The silence that had pressed against Alexander's chest for 18 months had lifted. The house felt different now. Not empty. Not abandoned. Not a museum of grief and lost dreams. Alive. Alexander held his daughters tighter and let himself feel something he'd forgotten existed. Hope. Not fragile, cautious hope that feared its own breaking. Not the dangerous hope he'd warned Rosa against. Real hope, the kind that costs everything and gives back more. The kind that demands you show up and believe even when the world tells you it's impossible. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. More therapy, certainly. More work. More challenges. The road ahead was long. His daughters had taken 3 steps today, not 30. This wasn't a miracle cure. It was a beginning. But for the first time in 18 months, Alexander Westbrook wasn't afraid of tomorrow. He finally understood what Rosa had been trying to show him all along. Miracles don't need permission. They don't wait for perfect conditions or guaranteed outcomes. They just need someone brave enough to believe they're possible. Alexander looked at Rosa, his voice steadier now. "I want to do it right this time. I want to help them. Really help them." He paused. "Will you teach me?" Rosa smiled through her tears, and something in her expression reminded him so much of Catherine it made his heart ache. "They don't need me to teach you, Mr. Westbrook," she said softly. "They just need their father, the one who's finally ready to see them." Alexander nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He held Ava, Ella, and Mia close, his girls, Catherine's girls, and felt something click into place inside his chest. Finally ready to be the father they deserved. For people sat on the playroom floor as the sun set, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. A broken man rebuilt. 3 little girls who'd defied the impossible, 1 woman who'd refused to stop believing. And somewhere in the light streaming through the windows, in the warmth that filled the room, there was a presence that felt like Catherine, smiling, watching, finally at peace because her family had found their way back to living. Because love, real love, never truly dies. It just waits, patient and faithful, for the moment when those left behind are finally ready to live again. And in that playroom, surrounded by colorful blankets and hand-painted butterflies, with his daughters in his arms and hope returning to a heart that had forgotten how to hold it, Alexander Westbrook was finally ready. The end.
If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know. Leave a red heart in the comments for every quiet miracle that begins with someone refusing to give up. If you believe that love can rewrite destinies, that hope can return even after unimaginable loss, like this video, so more stories like Alexander's, Rose's, and those 3 brave little girls can reach the people who need them most. And if you've ever felt broken, stuck, or convinced that it was too late, subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the story that saves you is the one you didn't know you needed to hear. Before you go, the next story is already waiting for you on the screen. If this journey reminded you that hope can return when we least expect it, let the next video carry you forward. And remember, miracles don't need permission, only belief.